Hello, Dias Muda agus Fultarov. You are very welcome to this episode of Badger Horns, where today we're going to be talking about one of my favourite mythological creatures, the Selkie. I'm going to tell you two of my favourite Selkie stories. We'll talk about them a little bit, and we'll be doing some Selkie-themed artwork along the way. So I hope you enjoy. So, who are the Selkies? Put simply, Selkies are seal people. The word Selkie is the Scots word for a grey seal, and it's those seals that are said to be able to shapeshift, unlike harbour seals, who are just seals. Selkies appear as seals in the water, but when they come onto land, they can shed their seal skin and become human for a time. Sometimes they can do this at will, or sometimes they can only do it at certain times of the year, depending on which story and which storyteller you are paying attention to. I think the modern popular image of the Selkie favours a feminine creature, but that's not all we find in the folklore. They are, for all intents and purposes, an entire community of people with varying personalities and demeanours. They're found in the folklore of Ireland and Scotland, Iceland and Scandinavia, and for our first story today we are visiting the Hebrides in Scotland, where one islander is having a particularly bad day. They say that Donal Rua was the best sealer west of Inverness. And truth be told, that was all people said about him because it was all they knew about him. He lived alone on a lonely island with a lonely name, and he would turn up on the docks with a boat full of seal skins, trade it for a boat full of dried fish, ale, and whatever else he needed, and then he'd go back home. The crowds of seals that lined Uigaroan kept Donal fed, and what's more comfortable, in summer sun and winter snow. But none of us stays on top. One morning, as Donal was out poaching rabbits, he crested a sand dune, and what should he see but a huge great bull seal sunning itself on the beach. Donal had never seen an animal of that size before, and the sight of it stopped him dead. And then his mind got to working, cogs started ticking, and he started thinking of how much oil an old seal like that must have in him, and how many boots you could make from his hide. Donal's mind went to his mallet at home, and to hoping the seal was still there when he returned, but his hand went to the sheath of his long knife. Now a seal's a tricky fellow to put down. Their skulls are like rocks, and their skin is inches thick. But Donal weighed his options, and taking out his long knife he crept low towards the beast, steadily making his way upwind. He was mere feet from the creature, quiet as you please. The seal snorted and opened its eyes. Donal pounced quick as thought, and in the long knife went, in to where a heart might be. But no. The seal roared and threw his head back, and where the head went, the front half of his bulk followed. Donal flew several metres across the sand and landed without grace on his rear end, the wind knocked out of him. Before he managed to scramble to his feet, the seal was already disappearing into the waves. The long knife, still embedded in its hide, glinted in the sunlight, and was gone. Donal trudged back to his one-room home, miserable with the loss of both his knife and the catch of a lifetime. And as night came on, he mended nets by firelight, until there came a knock at the door. Donal stared, and the door stood mute. He never had visitors, let alone at this hour. Maybe a fisherman was blown off course, or maybe he imagined it. The knocking came again. Donal eased out of his chair and opened the door, greeted by a dark-eyed stranger in a dark grey cloak. "Are you the seal hunter?" the man asked. "I suppose I am," said Donal. The dark man with the dark eyes stood in the doorway, and though he was illuminated by the fire, The night seemed to flow around him like ink. "I represent a gentleman," stated the stranger, "who would like you to procure for him 100 sealskins." Donald tried and failed to stifle an explosive laugh. "I couldn't get you 100 sealskins in a year," he said. "Well," said the stranger, "he'd like them by next Monday." Donald gave up on stifling the laugh, and the stranger waited patiently. "Look," says Donald, "I can't get you that many sealskins because there aren't that many seals." He made to close the door as if to say goodnight, but the stranger didn't move. "If you come with me now," said the stranger, "I can show you a place where there are more than enough seals to fill that order." "Pfft, I know this island like the back of my hand," says Donald. "Well, how many hairs are on the back of your hand?" the stranger asked. Donald grunted. He eyed the stranger warily. This seal thing was almost certainly too good to be true, but he supposed that after a day like today, he might as well humour the stranger. So out into the night the two go, and up onto a black horse, and away they go. The horse galloped through sand and marram grass, over ditches and across craggy plains as if it were unburdened, let alone carrying two men. They were going so fast that they overtook the wind ahead of them, and the wind behind couldn't catch up. Finally they came to a headland Donald knew well. There were no beaches or caves here, but climbing off of the horse, Donald humoured the man in the dark grey coat. His hand went to rest where his long knife should have been, and Donald felt uneasy for the first time. The stranger walked towards the cliffs that overlooked the sea, and Donald followed him warily. Looking down at the lack of beaches, caves, or even seals, Donald was in the process of thinking better of pointing out that absence when the stranger grabbed him. He took hold of Donald's shoulders and flung the both of them off the cliff. Donald went to let out a shout, but the ocean rose up to meet him, and the cold water froze the cry before it reached his lips. But the two men weren't slowed by the water's surface. Down they plunged, down through moonlit ocean, down through forests of kelp, as if being pulled by some invisible force. Donald struggled against his captor, but the dark man's grip was tight. A cavern loomed in sight, and they were drawn into it where the last rays of moonlight died, and still the stranger held Donald's shoulders tight. Drawn they were through a labyrinth of caves and twisting corridors in the weightless, black oblivion of the sea. Until a light shone ahead and got closer and closer, and just as Donald was giving up on breathing air again in his life, they broke through the surface of the water and landed on dry ground. Donald gasped and collapsed to his knees. He breathed deeply and clutched his chest, but his clothes weren't wet. He touched his face, his hair. He was dry as a bone. And then he looked around. He was in a huge candlelit cave surrounded by seals and the most sorrowful, dark-eyed people. The cave was thick with the wailing of these dark-eyed people and the seals. Like a choir, their mingled voices bounced from the vault of that great cavern to fill the air. Donald Rua had never heard such a sound. It had a horrible beauty to it. Half of him could have listened to that noise forever, and half of him wanted to run from that place. But where could he run to? He looked around the chamber and saw only walls and the pool that he had come in from. Climbing to his feet, he saw the stranger disappearing towards a great wooden doorway at the back of the cavern. Staggering to catch up, Donald tried not to disturb the sorrowful crowd that was gathered in that murky cave. The stranger looked back and shot Donald what might have been an encouraging smile. Maybe. As they walked through the crowd, some of the dark-eyed people stared at Donald. Some turned away, and some sobbed to themselves as the seals sang. Finally, they made their way to the great barnacle-encrusted door, and as it swung wide, Donald found himself in an extravagant chamber with silken throws and golden adornments of long-forgotten ages. On the other side of the room was a bed upon which an old man was lying, attended by several of the seals and dark-eyed people. As the dark stranger ushered Donal towards the bed, the people and seals surrounding the old man parted and stepped back, revealing that the old man had a wound in his ribs, and what's more, in the wound was a knife. Donal's eyes widened, and he thought of the big bull seal sunning itself on the beach earlier. Surely it couldn't be. The old man shifted and coughed as Donal approached. He knelt at the side of the bed, unable to summon any words. The old man groaned as he placed his hand on Donal's shoulder. With his other hand, he gestured at the gathered seals. "I'm their king, Donal. I'm their king, and I'm dying. I was the seal you sought to slaughter today," he said. "Your hand made this wound, and only by your hand can this wound be mended." Donal began sobbing. "I'm so sorry," said Donal. "I didn't know. I just didn't know." But the Seal King just clamped his hand down on Donal's shoulder. "You've done us great harm in your ignorance, Donal. But it's no good to live among strangers. If you take this knife from my side, I'll see to it that you're returned home safely." Summoning what little courage he had left, Donal stood up, nodded, and gently pulled the knife from the Seal King's wound. As he did so, the wound sealed shut behind the knife, and it was as if the weapon had never been there in the first place. The Seal King's recovery was immediate, and he stood up from the bed, and there came a great shout and cry and yelp of joy from all of his followers in the hall. And there was much rejoicing and celebrating, and the Seal King didn't take no for an answer, and they feasted and they drank lots of wonderful wine. I don't know what ocean wine is made of, but they drank more than their fair share of it. So when it came time to say goodbye and get back up on the dark stranger's horse, Donal was more than a little bit tipsy. But away they went anyway, and the horse galloped through sand and marram grass, over ditches and across craggy plains as if it were unburdened. And they were going so fast that they overtook the wind ahead of them, and the wind behind couldn't even catch up. The next morning, Donal Rua woke up and wondered whether he'd dreamt the whole thing. He opened his eyes, and hanging on the wall was his knife. Oh dear. All these years of seal hunting, he'd been hurting these people without even knowing about it. And now that he knew, he couldn't continue. He needed to find a new profession. He heaved himself from bed with a groan, half from the hangover and half from the guilt of a lifetime. And he was beginning to wonder what he had left to sell in town when he saw a bundle of cloth on the table. Or, not a bundle, a burlap sack, tied with old rope. And inside the bag was sand, crushed up shells, a faintly fishy odour, and a great many coins of Danish gold. He looked out at the calm Sunday tide and silently thanked the Selkie folk of Uigaron. And I'd wager myself that if he hasn't died, then Donal Rua is still living off that big bag of gold to this day. I like that story. I feel like it has something to say about the reciprocal nature of mercy. The Selkies don't threaten Donal, although taking Donal to an underwater cave might be slightly threatening in hindsight, but they just trust that once he realizes that he is doing something wrong, then he'll stop. Now, there are lots of versions of that story, although not all of them treat Donal or the Selkies quite as favourably. In one, a Danish fisherman loses his knife only to see it on the belt of a Faroese pub landlord years later. When asked about the knife, the landlord claims to have been stabbed with it years prior and tells of how he'd like to return the favour if he ever finds out who did it. There's an Irish language version, which is very similar, but for the fact that it's a tine from a pitchfork that breaks off in the seal. "You're lucky to be alive," says a much more jovial stranger in the pub, producing a broken pitchfork tine. "Because I was that seal." Another Irish story tells of how a man threw a rock at a seal, blinding it in one eye. Years later, during a storm, the man takes refuge in a fisherman's hut, but finds it inhabited by an old man with one eye. This version of Donal is promptly warned that while the Selkie is old now, his sons will soon come home, and they are much bigger and much stronger. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Donal goes back out into the storm. Maybe these widespread stories show just how quickly a tale can spread and evolve when the people telling it are sailors. Or maybe it just goes to show how pervasive the persecution of Selkies is in northwestern Europe. One thing I find interesting about these stories is the sophistication of the Selkies. They're well dressed and engage with human life by choice, but some of the Selkies choose to remain human for long enough to occupy fishing huts or own drinking establishments, perhaps forced out of their natural environment by human persecution. Not all of the sea's creatures are so lucky. These stories remind us of the personhood of the sea's inhabitants, and indeed of the sea itself. They remind us of how important it is not to harm these creatures and habitats, and how important it is to be kind to others, not just the people who look like us. Many families in Scotland and Ireland have associations with the people of the sea. Some supposedly have Fey ancestry from a distant Selkie relative like the Moors of Ireland. Others to this day live with curses and blessings bestowed by Selkies generations ago. These stories and superstitions have been around for hundreds of years, if not longer, and the story of the Selkie Wife is another tale that's common to a number of cultures. It's very similar to other stories about shape-shifting animal wives from all over the world, but it has a unique Atlantic twist. Sometimes in Ireland, the Selkie Wife is interchangeable with a mermaid. The Irish word for Selkie is maidin Vara, maiden of the sea, which itself is used to mean both mermaids and Selkies. The distinction in Ireland is only made through descriptions of the creature's seal-like qualities or its skin. Some stories and storytellers, such as the Irish language tale I mentioned earlier, don't give a name to the creature at all, and they prefer to leave it as a mystery as to how someone can be at once a man and a seal. Often in the story of the Selkie Wife, she has a trinket, such as a shell or a comb, that she needs in order to return to her true form. In this version, though, she lays her skin aside to enjoy the warmth of the summer sun. Tomas felt like he had cut peat his entire life. And today, just for a change, he was working under the beating sun, cutting peat. He'd never married, and after years of gentle teasing from the folk of the parish, his bachelor status was beginning to look like more of a permanent one. He wiped the sweat from his brow and looked down to the sea, where he saw a group of people dancing by the shore, wearing the most brilliant white clothes he had ever seen in his life. Deciding he needed to get a closer look, he crept down to the beach. Using rocks for cover, he watched their sport and dancing with confusion and awe, as their clothes were so fine and their faces were so handsome, he thought they must be representatives of the good people, the fairy folk. As he watched, a creature emerged from the waves. Pulling itself up onto dry land, it looked like a seal, but stood straighter and taller as it emerged from the ocean, until its leathery coat parted to reveal a beautiful woman with long blonde hair, dressed in the same fine white clothes that the other folk were. Tomas knew who these creatures were. They were the Selkies, who shed their skin and come on land for a time as humans. The woman laid her coat down on a large smooth rock that marked the centre of the beach and began combing her hair, watching the others at their sport. Tomas's eyes never left the woman until she stood up and strode across the beach to join her kin at dancing. He looked at the beautiful woman and at the coat she left on the rocks, and a plan began to form in his mind. Whether by vanity or stupidity, he stealthily snatched the woman's sealskin coat and snuck off home, where he hid it in the thatch of his roof. Without her coat, she wouldn't be able to return to her seal form, and perhaps then Tomas might be able to make a bride of her. So Tomas walked back to where he was cutting turf, to where he had a view of the beach, but he sees no one down there, and then comes a shout from behind him. You! You took my skin! Tomas whirled round to see the beautiful young lady, full of rage. I'm sorry, but I think you're wearing your skin, said Tomas, feigning ignorance. Don't be smart with me. I'm the daughter of the king beneath the sea, and if I don't get my skin back, I'll... She trailed off because she wasn't actually sure what the king beneath the sea could do beyond the shoreline. Honestly, said Tomas, I haven't seen your skin. Oh, she said, and her eyes narrowed. Give me my skin back. Look, seriously, I haven't seen your skin, but I'll gladly help you look, said Tomas with a smile, and the Selkie woman eyed him suspiciously. Come on, said Tomas, what colour is it? It's grey, she says with a frown, and it has freckles of black. Grey with black freckles, he repeated. My name's Tomas, by the way, and he held his hand out. She didn't take it. She just said, Mwydden. And away they go, and Tomas is feigning to look in every high place and every low place, and between the rocks and in sandy rabbit warrens, and everywhere else you might look for a stolen Selkie skin, except for the thatched roof of Tomas's cottage. Then the sun began to set, and he says to the seal lady, Look, why don't you come back to my house and get some rest, and we'll continue looking tomorrow. So back they went to Tomas's house, and he made sure that she felt at home, or at least as much as she could feel at home on dry land, because, being a Selkie, she wanted nothing more than to be in the ocean. And as they ate dinner, there was a great wailing and roaring from the strand, and Mwydden looked forlorn. What's wrong? Asked Tomas. And she says, That's my father. He doesn't know where I am, and if I don't find my skin, I'll never be able to go back to the ocean, and I'll never be with my family again. Don't worry, says Tomas. We'll look tomorrow. And look they did. Though Tomas had work to do, he made sure to appear to be helping Mwydden wherever he could. And that night, don't worry, he says, we'll look again tomorrow. And the night after that, don't worry, we'll look again tomorrow. And on they go like that, until in her heart she has all but given up. And eventually they married so as not to arouse suspicions. And time crept up on them as time often does, and before you know it, 7 summers have come and gone, and they've 7 children. For all intents and purposes, they look like a normal family, except sometimes people claimed that they'd seen Mwydden wandering the beaches at low tide, as though she'd lost something. She hadn't given up all hope, you see. She'd grown accustomed to her new life, but she longed for the sea like a dog secretly longs for the forest, and at the time of the 7th stream a great roaring would come from the ocean, and her father would be looking for her. And when Tomas was at his work, she would ask the children if they'd seen anything like a leather coat about the house, and always the answer was no. Until one day, the oldest of the children were playing hide-and-seek as Mwydden washed clothes in a wooden tub. Avoid, came a voice from behind her. Codé shin. She turned and tutted at the child's appearance, covered head to toe in dust and straw as he was, before following his pointing finger back towards another child, who was carrying a bundle of silver, leathery material and roof thatching. At once she was full of relief and jubilation and sorrow and white, hot rage. The child was carrying her sealskin. Stashed in the thatch for 7 years, it was covered in straw, but otherwise hadn't a single mark on it. Taking it in her hands, she felt it on her fingertips, and tears formed in her eyes. Tomas had lied, and she hadn't believed him. No, she hadn't really believed him. He was a human after all, but a small part of her needed to believe him, because it was easier than the more uncomfortable truth. Leaving everything as it was, one by one she kissed her children on the forehead and walked down to the shore where the big bull seal was swimming back and forth and roaring a celebration. And as she neared the shore, he was joined by more and more seals in chorus. Tomas heard the commotion, but too late. He arrived just in time to see Mwydden putting on her sleek sealskin coat and diving into the water. Finally free, she raced through the water with all the surprising agility of her kin, and she was gone beneath the waves. For many years after that, her children would go down to the shore as the tide was ebbing, and on the great smooth rock in the centre of the beach they would find beautiful shells from the seafloor and all manner of delicious fish, shining pearls and long-lost coins. Though they never saw the blonde-haired woman they loved again, the children often saw a seal in the water swimming the length of the beach and singing the way seals sing. And sometimes in the evening there was a voice on the wind. On ocean waves or golden strand, of two minds I must be. I've 7 children on the land, and 7 in the sea. So there you have it. 2 very different stories about Selkies, but I think they're sort of bound together by the fact that they both have something to say about how we view our ownership of or dominion over nature, and how we view the personhood of creatures and habitats. I think part of why Selkies fascinate us is that they operate within so many liminal spaces. They are of the land and the sea, they're animal and they're human, they're wild yet they're sophisticated, they're entirely natural and yet they're somehow supernatural. As modern humans, I think we long to be in touch with nature, but know that we will always be apart from it to some extent. Even at the most basic level, we survive by bending nature to our will with fire and clothing. The Selkie, on the other hand, needs only her skin. And when that's lost, she must adopt the ways of humans. She's abducted from her own space, and she has to live outside of nature's balance the way that we do. I hope you enjoyed these stories as much as I do, and I hope you'll join me for the next episode, whatever that may be. Slán go fóill a chairde. Goodbye for now.